We are on the lunch break of day 31 of the Undercover Policing Inquiry Tranche 2 Phase 2. We've been listening to the live evidence of Andy Coles, the live lies I should say really. It has been full of questions about his role as an undercover officer within Hunsab groups, animal rights groups, anarchist groups, peace groups, and numerous other things besides. I'm joined by Jim Simpson, who's been following the hearing with me. What did you make of the evidence we've heard so far?
Well, firstly, Jessica was amazing this morning for the first 15-20 minutes, and it was good that the inquiry gave her the opportunity to have that space to add to her evidence, because it's a lot to do in one session as the emotion builds up during the day. And she was fantastic again this morning. Andy Coles is different to Lambert. He talks more and he does remember slightly more, but he's I'm all right down here now. Thanks.
We've just managed to get another seat. One sec. Very, very different sort of style. Certainly, someone who kind of was like he's not playing the doddering old man routine, which we got from Coles, Lambert rather.
I suspect he wouldn't be able to do that, given that he still has a viable role in as president of a Conservative association in Kent or Peterborough, wherever he is. Yeah. So I suspected he wouldn't be able to do that because they might not let him back in. Although there's probably a lot of dodgy old men in that association, I'd imagine. He's a lot. I think he's a lot more slippery. But over 3 days, I think he's going to find himself in a lot of trouble with the explanations he has to keep continually giving.
I think he's fucked up a few times already, hasn't he? Because he's admitted to consuming drugs, to smoking cannabis, to not really drugs, but anyway, but to shoplifting, to various areas of. So areas of low level criminality, which he was allowed, didn't even bother reporting to the manager. They knew that this was like a given.
And he was talking about skipping, wasn't he?
Yeah. But I mean, before the skipping, he was on about shoplifting from multinationals. He tried to dial it down as he was being questioned about it. He also talked about having to prove yourself by doing serious criminal acts, in order to get into an Animal Liberation Front cell. It was literally the last thing was him saying, as had been done before by the likes of Bob Lambert and John Dines. Sort of admitting that like kind of criminality was accepted by the bosses, something that has been rejected by Lambert in his evidence.
I think that's one thing that I was here for 5 days of Lambert and today as well, that Bar's quite good at leaving us on our breaks on a bit of a cliffhanger like that. So we have that hanging in the air of what criminality, or we know kind of what criminality, but it's going to be how he's going to try and explain his way out of certain actions that he probably promoted and invoked as part of a cell he created in the ALF. I'm treading fairly carefully because I didn't read the restriction orders very well this morning at all.
I think you're okay for restriction orders pretty much, because there are a couple of things that may come up later, but because it's being live streamed, I don't think there's anything at the particular moment there's anything to worry about. There's been Lucy the dog, yeah, that's what I was going to get onto. There's been a few ridiculous sort of sections of things he's been questioned about, and it's not so much as anything ridiculous about him having a dog. It makes a lot of sense for his cover. You know, animal rights groups, very common for people to have companion animals. But what was strange is that when he was questioned by Operation Hearn, he said that the reason he had Lucy the dog was to dissuade female attention, to put off women from approaching him, which made no sense. I think David Barr did very skillfully sort of explain that not only were animal rights activists fond of dogs, that certain animal rights activists were particularly fond of dogs, and nobody is more fond of dogs than Jessica.
Exactly. And yes, he got very much caught in a web of his own making there with Barr, and I feel that is a good sign for the rest of proceedings with Coles, because he's just going to keep wrapping himself around in these ridiculous explanations. The Operation Hearn stuff's amazing. I think they should keep using that more and more. Some of the best bits with Lambert in the early parts of the week was when he just getting confronted with what he'd been chatting about with Hearn. And because of the nature of Hearn compared to the inquiry, it's a useful utility to catch these people out in their lies, because they are very adept liars.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if people are unsure, like Operation Hearn was an internal police investigation. It seems that the investigators just sat down for a cosy chat with the former undercover officers. They didn't make extensive notes. They made shorthand notes, of which we see copies of. But it seems that the undercover officers were much more candid when they were talking to them.
I don't think they ever meant to get out to us, did they, at all?
I mean, nothing.
Yes,
Nothing was meant to get out to us.
But particularly with Hearn, that was sort of an internal inquiry, wasn't it, or investigation by the police into itself, and then through the work that people like yourself have done, that's come to the foreground, hasn't it?
I mean, I think the thing with Operation Hearn was when the police were first ordered to give all the documents they had about undercover operations to the inquiry, they didn't provide much in the way of original reports. In order to make sure they gave them something, they gave all the Hearn investigation documents, which... and it was only then when the security services, Box 500, said, we've got copies of all the original reports, that there was any real sort of depth of inclusion of original documents. And I think that the police had thought giving Operation Hearn documents was like kind of a way of shutting up the inquiry without giving anything too much away. As it turns out, these have been some of the most notable, like, smoking gun moments that we've had in the questioning. It was in terms of the Lucy the dog thing. It was kind of pointed out that the reason he'd said this is he was so keen to impress upon the Operation Hearn investigators that he was putting off women from making advances towards him. I mean, that's borne out with some of the other statements, which are quite ridiculous, that he said to Operation Hearn about, he was that these women were making advances towards him and he was having to knock them back, rather than what we've heard repeatedly from numerous witnesses, that was very much the other way around.
But it kind of shows what Operation Hearn was and how casual it was, because the idea that an animal rights activist will be pissed off by somebody that has a dog is ridiculous, but it doesn't get investigated or interrogated at all by Operation Hearn. It's just left to sit there, and in the end, 6, 7, 8 years later, that's great for us now, and great for Barr and the inquiry to show Coles up in his lies, because he can't explain his way out of certain situations like that.
Talking about other things he can't explain his way out of, we saw a report. We've seen a lot of reports. I mean, particularly we saw early on of these profiles of activists that Coles had written. We saw a whole bunch of them about women activists, where he's describing them as very attractive, words to that effect, about how good looking they are. He's called up on that. He was absolutely steadfast, didn't change his position, was very clear that they were attractive, so obviously had to go in the report. It's pointed out to him these are subjective things, not very useful for identifying anybody. He seemed to reject that entirely. But then we came much later on to another profile that he'd submitted, or someone had submitted, that was about him. That was about the fictional activist Andy Davey, aka Andy Van. And he said, why on earth were you filing these reports? Well, reports being filed, it's unclear who had actually written it, about you. And he's like, and he floundered around. It was put that it was fear of internal internal retribution, insider retribution, that was it. And he was, no, it would have been another special branch or something. People were asking about me. I was so visible. It was just sense of completeness or something. None of that bore true. It didn't sound true at all, any of that sort of stuff he was saying.
No, he was completely floundering there, and it's a little bit of a shame. I think that they picked at that a little bit longer, I think, because that was fairly interesting. The other bit that I think will become more apparent in tranche 3, but for the first time, Peter Francis' witness statement came up, and we discussed Potter,
potty-mouthed Potter.
See, a DCI or something as a senior police officer in the SCS anyway.
Chief Superintendent.
Going into parties and no, not parties. It was a charismatic church, was what Andy Cole said, wasn't it?
Essentially, he'd been to a meeting at the STS Safe House where he, according to Peter Francis, had been drunk, loud, very sexist, very racist, very liberal uses of the N-word. He'd then been taken by a driver whilst drunk back to wherever he was going, and he'd stopped the car, got out, gone into a charismatic church, and had racially abused, in quite extreme terms, the worshippers there.
And sexually abused or assaulted in ways, wasn't it? He, I think that's what Barr said as well.
There was definitely that he used sexist terms.
Unwanted advances, maybe.
Unwanted advances, yeah, going to try and kiss women. That's yes, he had, yeah. This leads to his arrest and the end of his career. As it turns out, he's just moved sideways within Special Branch. It's not the end of his career entirely. It's just internally he has to change careers. I mean, this is from a time when the police could really do anything they wanted. It would never it might harm their career slightly, but it would never mean they were unemployed.
I slightly disagree that time has come to an end, Tom, to be honest. But I feel like these people pop up at...
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true. I mean, I think we do live in a time where there are a lot more police officers lose their jobs than has ever been known before in British policing history. It's very very recent, but there have been numerous ones very recently. I mean, this is why the Met Police is in special measures. There are, there's numerous newspaper reports pretty much every day of officers being found guilty of possessing images of child pornography, of taking part in sexual assaults, rape whilst on duty, and so forth.
WhatsApp chat groups around victims in parks and stuff. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, it has changed to a certain extent. I'm not saying it's better, like particularly, but it has changed somewhat. Back then, though, it would have been absolutely unthinkable. We also saw reports about the founding of Earth First UK, which Andy Cole said he was a founder member of, and then within moments was like, well, that's just a fancy way of saying I was at the first meeting. But I mean,
it was the way he so proudly said the first time he said I was a founding member of Earth First, and then he kind of backtracked a lot and said, yeah, I was just in a meeting room when it started.
But I mean, the interesting thing about that, it was put to him that none of his reports would have been unique. That there would have been other sources of information on Carmageddon, which was the launch of Reclaim the Streets, which was done as part of the Earth First Roadshow, initial Earth First Roadshow. And he said, well, yeah, that wouldn't have been unique, and it's very difficult to talk about without going into a different area, and things move on very quickly. This is one of the signs we see of there being, like, when we talk about the SDS being just one small part of the wider infrastructure of repression that exists towards radical movements, this is one of the glimpses we get of there being other things, there being other undercover officers, there being other sources of information within the groups. I mean, I always think those moments are very telling, and it's how quickly Barr always moves on, just at the sight of that.
It's like all the security apparatus, isn't it? An iceberg, and the undercover research group, cops and police spies out of lies, you're like the global warming that's forced it down a little bit, that sea level, and we just got a bit poking above the head that you can pick away at a little bit. But there is a significant and probably much larger part underneath the surface that hopefully, through the work that everyone does, you eventually get towards, or further towards.
Maybe one day in 2043 we'll be sitting here talking about that stuff. But we've only got a short lunch break as ever. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think when we return back to Stephen Lawrence over the next in the spring as well, I think that's going to be a huge story, and there's a lot of very unanswered questions about that, and Peter Francis's evidence is going to be certainly worth watching.
I mean, yeah, I would say Andy Cole was particularly pathetic when questioned about his...
He didn't have any answers, and the ones he was given about how officers in the SDS were acting around the time of the murder of Stephen Lawrence and after was not convincing in any way, shape or form. He's just trying to say the SWP were out to corrupt and exploit the Lawrence family, which I don't think is a very plausible explanation for.
I mean, it was just a nonsense. It was a pure nonsense. I mean, he also talked about the fact that we all had such sympathy for the family. They had to fight for so long. It was like, hang on, we're on about the initial moment. Nonsense. Anyway, we're going to go and get some lunch. We'll be back. The hearing restarts at 1:05 with a 10-minute delay. It means the live stream should start about 1:15. We'll be reporting throughout and going to do another video in the next break. Cheers. Thanks for joining.